Albert Camus was born on November 7, 1913, in Mondovi, a small agricultural town in French Algeria, into a world already shaped by poverty, silence, and displacement. His origins were neither metropolitan nor privileged. They were colonial, Mediterranean, and working class, rooted in a landscape that would mark him as deeply as any book ever could. Camus would spend his entire life suspended between worlds, between Algeria and France, between belonging and exile, between moral clarity and political ambiguity. That tension begins at his birth. Before Camus could speak, his father was gone. Lucien Camus, a labourer of Alsatian descent, was conscripted into the French army at the outbreak of the First World War and mortally wounded at the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Camus would grow up without a memory of him, knowing his father only through fragments, a name, a faded photograph, a story of death. War entered Camus' life before consciousness did. Violence, loss, and absence were not later philosophical abstractions for him, they were present at the foundation of his being. Camus was raised in the Belcourt district of Algiers, a poor, working-class neighborhood. He lived in a small, crowded apartment with his mother Catherine, his grandmother, and his uncle. His mother was nearly deaf, illiterate, and emotionally reserved. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were spare. Camus would later describe her as a figure of immense quiet dignity, someone who endured without complaint and without explanation. In her silence, Camus learned one of the central moral lessons of his life, that suffering does not announce itself, that it often exists without language, and that it does not require metaphysical justification to be real. The family was poor, but Camus would later insist that his childhood was not unhappy. What they lacked in money, they had in light, sea, and physical immediacy. Algeria offered something the Parisian intellectual world never could: a sensory abundance, sun on the skin, salt in the air, the physical presence of the world. Camus grew up with a deep awareness of the body and of the present moment, long before he encountered philosophy. This grounding would later make him suspicious of abstract systems that ignored the concrete texture of human life. The decisive turning point in Camus' childhood came through education. His elementary school teacher, Louis Germain, recognized his intelligence and intervened on his behalf. In a colonial society designed to reproduce class hierarchy, Germain insisted that Camus be allowed to continue his studies. Without that intervention, Camus would likely have left school early to work, as most children of his background did. Camus never forgot this. Decades later, when he received the Nobel Prize, he wrote to Germain, thanking him for having extended a hand to a poor child who might otherwise have remained in ignorance. This sense of gratitude would never leave him. For Camus, education was not a privilege to be taken for granted. It was a moral inheritance, fragile, contingent, and deeply human. It taught him that justice begins not in grand theories, but in small acts of attention. As a young man, Camus thrived intellectually and physically. He was an excellent student and an accomplished football goalkeeper. Goalkeeping appealed to him not for glory, but for its demands. Constant vigilance, responsibility, and the knowledge that one mistake could undo everything. He later said that football taught him more about morality than many books. The goalkeeper must stand alone, alert, responsible for what enters the goal. It is a position that mirrors Camus' later sense of moral responsibility. This promising life was interrupted when Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis at the age of 17. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was not merely a medical condition. It was a sentence of uncertainty and isolation. Camus was forced to abandon sports, interrupt his studies, and confront the fragility of his own body. He spent long periods confined, separated from normal life, waiting to see whether he would recover. Tuberculosis brought death close. It was no longer an abstract idea. It was something that could arrive without warning, without justice, without explanation. Camus would live with this knowledge for the rest of his life. His philosophy of limits, of mortality, of refusal to accept false consolation is inseparable from this early confrontation with illness. Camus went on to study philosophy at the University of Algiers. He was drawn not to systematic metaphysics, but to thinkers who respected the limits of human understanding. Greek philosophy, especially the tragic tradition and Aristotle's sense of measure, appealed deeply to him. The Greeks did not promise salvation. They accepted finitude without despair. This resonated with Camus far more than Christian or Hegelian systems that claimed to reconcile all contradictions. At the same time, Camus immersed himself in theatre and journalism. Theatre taught him that truth is embodied, not abstract. Journalism taught him that words carry responsibility. Both disciplines reinforced his instinctive resistance to ideological thinking that treats human beings as means rather than ends. In the 1930s, Camus briefly joined the French Communist Party, driven by outrage at colonial injustice and economic inequality. His motivation was moral, not doctrinal. He cared about the suffering of the poor, the marginalized, the colonized, but he soon grew disillusioned with the party's rigid orthodoxy and its willingness to excuse violence in the name of historical necessity. He recoiled from any system that subordinated individual suffering to an abstract future. Camus was eventually expelled from the party, and the experience confirmed his deepest suspicions about ideology. He came to believe that political systems, once absolutized, become morally blind. They begin to justify cruelty by calling it progress. This insight would later place him in bitter conflict with many of his contemporaries. During this period, Camus began publishing essays that revealed his emerging worldview. In Nuptials and The Wrong Side and the Right Side, he wrote about beauty and suffering, sunlight and death, the sea and injustice. These texts are lyrical but not naive. They affirm life without denying its cruelty. Camus does not try to reconcile the two. He insists they coexist. Even in his earliest work, Camus refuses transcendence. He does not look beyond the world for meaning. He looks more deeply into it. He affirms the physical present, the warmth of stone, the shimmer of water, the intensity of being alive, without pretending that these experiences solve the problem of suffering. When war came, Camus' life changed irrevocably. In 1940, he moved to France just as the country fell under German occupation. Cut off from Algeria, frequently ill, and living under censorship, Camus joined the French resistance. He became editor of the underground newspaper Combat, writing articles that called for justice without hatred and resistance without fanaticism. Camus believed that even in war there are limits. He rejected both collaboration and terror. He argued that one must fight injustice without becoming unjust. This position was difficult, and it would later cost him friendships and allies, but Camus never abandoned it. During this period, Camus published The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus, works that would define his place in 20th century thought. These were not academic texts. They were expressions of a worldview shaped by poverty, illness, colonialism, and war. The Stranger tells the story of Meursault, a man condemned not only for murder but for refusing to pretend that life has the meaning society demands. The myth of Sisyphus articulates the philosophical foundation of that refusal, the absurd. Camus does not say the world is evil, he says it is silent, and he asks how a human being can live honestly in that silence. Camus emerged from the war not as a victorious intellectual, but as a man burdened by what he had witnessed. The occupation had confirmed his deepest convictions, that suffering does not obey theory, that death is not redeemed by ideas, and that moral clarity becomes most fragile precisely when people believe they are serving history. Out of this experience came The Plague, a novel that would become one of the defining moral texts of the 20th century. Set in the Algerian city of Oran during an epidemic, The plague is not simply an allegory of fascism, though it was often read that way. It is a meditation on how human beings behave when confronted with meaningless suffering. The plague arrives without explanation. It kills without justice. It offers no reason for its presence. The doctors, journalists, and ordinary citizens of Oran are forced to decide how to respond to a disaster that cannot be morally or metaphysically explained. Camus does not give his characters grand speeches about meaning. Instead, he gives them work. They organize hospitals, they record deaths, they care for the sick, they do not hope for a miracle, they do not pretend the suffering makes sense. They act because people are dying, and something must be done. In this, the plague becomes Camus' clearest ethical statement, that decency does not require belief in redemption. It requires presence, effort, and solidarity. This ethic placed Camus increasingly at odds with the intellectual climate of post-war France. As revolutionary ideologies gained influence, many thinkers embraced the idea that violence could be justified by historical necessity. Jean-Paul Sartre, once Camus' ally, defended revolutionary terror as the price of progress. Camus could not accept this. For him, no future could justify the deliberate killing of human beings in the present. This disagreement came to a head with the publication of The Rebel. In this book, Camus traced the history of rebellion from metaphysical revolt against God to political revolution against tyranny. His argument was simple but devastating. Rebellion becomes tyranny when it abandons limits. When a movement claims that history itself guarantees its righteousness, it begins to excuse any cruelty in the name of the future. Camus insisted that revolt must remain grounded in respect for human life. Without limits, rebellion turns into terror. This stance made him enemies on both the left and the right. He was accused of moralism, cowardice, and political naivety. Sartre publicly broke with him, and much of the French intellectual elite followed. For Camus, this was not merely a professional rupture, it was a moral exile. He found himself increasingly isolated, belonging fully to no camp. This isolation deepened with the Algerian War of Independence. As a French Algerian, Camus opposed colonial injustice but feared the descent into terrorism and civil war. He pleaded for a civilian truce, for the protection of innocent lives. No one listened. To French nationalists, he was a traitor. To Algerian revolutionaries, he was a colonialist. To Parisian intellectuals, he was a moral obstruction. Camus stood alone, refusing to justify murder no matter who committed it. This loneliness permeates his later work. In The Fall, Camus presents a narrator consumed by guilt and self-judgment, exposing the hypocrisies of moral superiority. The novel is dark, ironic, and stripped of consolation. It reflects Camus's growing awareness that even those who claim moral righteousness are often motivated by vanity and fear. In 1957, Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. At 44, he was one of its youngest recipients. In his acceptance speech, he spoke not of triumph, but of responsibility. He insisted that the writer must stand with the suffering, not above them. He spoke as a man who had seen too much to believe in easy answers. Camus did not live long after receiving the prize. On January 4, 1960, he was killed in a car accident while traveling through rural France. In his pocket was an unfinished manuscript, The First Man, a return to his childhood in Algeria. It was a final attempt to reconcile memory, silence, and origin. It revealed a Camus still searching, still rooted in the poverty and sunlight of his youth. Albert Camus' life never found consolation. He did not believe in final redemption, historical destiny, or divine justice. But he believed in lucidity, in limits, and in the stubborn dignity of human effort. His philosophy of the absurd was not born in abstraction. It was forged in poverty, illness, war, and exile. When Camus wrote about Sisyphus pushing his stone, he was not writing about an ancient myth. He was writing about himself and about all who live without guarantees. Like Sisyphus, Camus believed that consciousness is the final rebellion. To see the world clearly and to refuse both despair and illusion is, for him, the highest form of courage. And so his life, like his philosophy, ends without consolation, but not without meaning. Not a meaning imposed from above, but a meaning created in endurance, in attention, and in the refusal to surrender to false hope. During this period, Camus published The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus, works that would define his place in 20th century thought. These were not academic texts. They were expressions of a worldview shaped by poverty, illness, colonialism, and war. The Stranger tells the story of Meursault, a man condemned not only for murder but for refusing to pretend that life has the meaning society demands. The myth of Sisyphus articulates the philosophical foundation of that refusal, the absurd. Camus does not say the world is evil, he says it is silent, and he asks how a human being can live honestly in that silence.